So we're picking up in Job chapter 40. It'll actually be this week and next week to finish the book of Job, and then we'll be doing some topics in Proverbs this summer, followed by a long walk through Matthew that will start this fall. And so we've been in Job now for a couple of months. We're nearing the resolution of the book. Job's life has been destroyed. He lost his kids, he lost his fortune, he lost his fame in an instant, and he never learned why. His friends came along to try to help, and they tried to convince him that to suffer this greatly, you must have sinned greatly. God only allows this to happen in your life as an equivalent punishment for sin that you've committed, so just fess up, and maybe that will end this whole thing. But Job hadn't sinned greatly. And so he understandably complained about how things were going. And he had two main categories of complaint. The first one is that the world and the life that God made is not good. And he said in Job 14:1, "Man who is born of woman is few of days and full of trouble." He's, God, you've made this world, and we're born into it. We don't live that long, but while we do, nothing but trouble. The world that God made is not good. And then his other complaint, and his deeper and probably darker complaint, was that he thought that God is not good. I mean, he says this to God in Job chapter 10, verse 3, "Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands, and favor the designs of the wicked?" So he says, God, I mean, you made me just so you could despise me? So you could show favoritism to the wicked and so you could torture the just? I'm good and I'm oppressed and I'm suffering. Wicked people have it really good. It seems, God, like you're not good. And so that's how it looks to Job. His friends come in and they say, Job, you're your own worst enemy. Job thinks that God is his worst enemy. And through it all, Job doesn't ask to get back all the stuff that he's lost, except for one thing, and that's the closeness with the God that he once knew. As Job wrestles through all this, he isn't perfect, but he does keep clinging to God, and he refuses to curse God and die. And so after Job and his friends go round and round for a long time, finally at the end, God speaks into the chaos. And God gives some very mysterious answers, some very unexpected answers, but he gives good answers. And they're answers that don't fully explain his plan for all of our suffering, but they do prove that God hasn't abandoned us in our suffering. And so to answer that first complaint that the world isn't good, God took Job on a verbal tour of the cosmos. He pointed out all of his goodness in creation. He pointed out all the ways that he still cares for it, that he's still intimately involved with his creation. He showed that he still ruled over it and that he was moving it toward his intended end. And so he demonstrated in his first speech that he understood far more than Job did about the world that he made. And so in response to that first speech, Job said this is Job 40, verse 3. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, 'Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further.'" So Job withdraws his complaint. He says, I'm not going to complain anymore. I'm just going to be quiet. I spoke some stuff I didn't really understand. But God's gracious and kind. He doesn't just leave it there. He's the God of how much more. And so he's not just after a ceasefire. He's not after a partial peace with Job or a false peace with Job. He loves Job. And he's working to restore Job to a relationship with himself. And so God speaks again. So it's almost like God is saying, you may have decided to be quiet, Job, but you still have these thoughts. Specifically, you still have these thoughts that I'm not good. So let me address those. And he continues to show himself to be so kind, so willing to condescend, so eager to bridge the gap between God and Job that Job could never bridge on his own. So God makes a second speech that we'll look at today. And then at the end of that second speech, just to show you where this is all going, in Job chapter 42, verse 1, it says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear and I will speak. I will question you and you make it known to me. I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." And so at the end, Job says, man, I'm not silent anymore. I'm speaking to you. I'm knowing that I'm heard. He had said before in chapter 9, verse 16, that God would never listen if he had a chance to talk to him, but now he knows God is hearing him. And he says, now my eye sees God. It's like his fellowship with God has been restored. He's closer to God even than he was before. And he's still sitting on his ash heap. He's still in his suffering, but he's back with God. And at the end, he says, I repent in dust and ashes, which could literally be translated, I'm comforted about the dust and the ashes. In other words, whatever happens in this second speech brings him to a place where he's finally comforted about all that suffering that he went through. He gets back to that place where he's once again enchanted with God. And so what is it in this second speech that God says that makes all the difference? Because at first glance, as you read through these speeches, it seems like God just describes 2 more animals. I mean, he had just described 8 animals in the previous speech, and after that, Job decided to be quiet, but then God goes on and he describes 2 more animals, and Job's all better? I mean, it's like Job is on the outs with God. God shows him a hippo, and Job says, well, my kids all died, but hippos are cool, so I guess I'm okay now. Like, there's got to be more going on there. And so what is it in this second speech that restored that vitality of his relationship with God? And might it be there for us too? I mean, there are some things that God says here in this second speech that can change the way that we think about the world, that can change the way we think about evil and chaos in the world, and some things that can help re-enchant us with God as well. Not as a magic bullet that solves all of our problems in an instant, but as one more ingredient that helps us think about God the right way as we go through a life that has all kinds of suffering in it. And so Job chapter 40, verse 6, it says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? And so that's the question that's going to be answered here. Is Job right to say that God has been wrong, that God is unjust? And God will go on and he'll give an answer to that question in 3 main parts. The first one starts in verse 9. He says, have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. Now, the point here is mainly overlap with one of the things we talked about last week, so we'll kind of fly over this first point. But God is saying that one day he will bring the proud low. He will judge. God's saying that he has a strong arm, that he has the power to judge evil. He says he can know someone all the way to the bottom and judge them. He has the power to send them to death, and not just to death, he has power over them continuing in the afterlife, verse 13, in the world below. And so God here says to Job, if you can do that better than I can, then you're in a position to instruct me on how to do justice. You know, I spend fall Sunday afternoons yelling at Josh Allen, telling him how he could do his job better, and that's just the Sunday afternoon pastime. And imagine if he could hear me, and then one day he looks into the camera, and he's going to answer as I'm telling him how to be a better quarterback for the Bills. Like, he could say to me, can you leap over a defender, get pummeled into the turf, and then stand up and do it again 30 seconds later? To which my response would be, I get injured sleeping. And so no, I'm really not in a position to tell you how to be a quarterback. And so God here in speaking to Job is saying, can you judge someone all the way to the bottom? Can you continue to make sure that sin is paid for even in the afterlife? As soon as you can do that, you let me know and I'll take your advice on how to do justice. So that's the first answer. Then he goes on and he gives him a second answer, and the second and third answers are descriptions of these really mysterious creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And so Job chapter 40, verse 15, he says, behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He's the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword, for the mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plant he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus tree covers him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he's not frightened. He's confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by the eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? Now, there doesn't seem to be like widespread agreement on what behemoth was. I think you could make the case that it's a hippo. The name behemoth literally means the beast or the super beast. And it seems to be some kind of bovine super beast that really existed, but in many of the surrounding areas started to be worshipped as God and have a lot of mythology attached to it. So for example, the Egyptians would tell stories of some of their gods appearing as hippopotami and going to war. And so it's this beast that was a real beast, but was also thought to be more than an ordinary animal. It was thought to be supernatural even. And the first thing God says about him is, I made him just like I made you. That you might think that it's a godlike creature, but it is part of the creation. It's got huge strength, but it's a created being. And then in verse 19, it says that his maker is bringing near his sword. It's like God is going to slaughter this unslaughterable beast. Like that we think that is so intimidating. Who could ever wage war against behemoth? And God says, I'm basically its rancher. I could handle this. This is not a big deal to me at all. God's not equaled by it. God's the owner over it. And so here, this animal that's come to be thought of as a supernatural evil power is tamed by God completely. So this is the beast that the nations fear. And it's not a big deal to God. So Job's thoughts that supernatural evil that's out there in the world is too big, too powerful, it's too untamable, not true. We'll focus more on the next creature here, and that's Leviathan. So Job 41, verse 1, he says, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? And so this Leviathan is a sea creature. And in the minds of people in their day, the sea was the symbol of unpredictable, untamable chaos. Because storms came up quickly, they didn't have weather.com, so they would come up, they didn't know these things were coming. Huge waves would rise up, they'd crash against the boats, none of it could be predicted. And then what was under the sea was an even bigger mystery. I mean, we have underwater cameras and submarines, so we've seen a lot more, but there's still a ton of mystery as far as what's going on down there. It is vast and mysterious. There's scary stuff down there. I know for me, I love going to the ocean. I love being at the ocean. Like one of the most refreshing things is to go to the ocean or go to the mountains and spend some time just reading a book in the quiet, walking along the shore, but not so much going in the ocean. Like, my wife, Debbie, she likes to swim in the ocean. I like to walk along the side of the ocean because there's a lot in there that wants to kill you. And you can't see it. Like, you don't know what's there. You don't know what it wants to do. But you know, I mean, there are dangerous things there. There was a time a couple of years ago that we were at the ocean with our family, and one of our daughters went out into the ocean with my wife swimming recklessly. And so I was on the shore, and then my daughter started like screaming. And so I run out, and it turns out a school of jellyfish came by and had stung her leg a little bit. And so I obviously did my job as a father to comfort her. But in my mind, I was saying, I told you, like, this is what it's like. Like it's chaos. It's unpredictable. The ocean is for walking along, not for swimming in. And so here within this chaotic, powerful sea is another real creature that started to become thought of in supernatural terms, this Leviathan. A chaotic, untamable, serpent-like super creature within the chaotic, untamable sea. And because Leviathan lived in the water, it was even more mysterious to people. I mean, they would only see parts of it as at a time, and so their imagination would run wild as far as like, what is this Leviathan? If they just saw those parts surfacing above the water, in fact, if you Google pictures of Leviathan, they don't all look like each other. I mean, they range from crocodile, which some people say that this text is just describing a crocodile, which I don't think so at all, to like these supernatural looking like dragon type creatures. And I don't know of any creatures that we would think today are not extinct that meet this description of Leviathan, so I'm not sure what it was, but it does seem like it's some kind of untamable sea dragon. And that huge water dragon serpent creature came to represent unstoppable satanic power. And people all over the ancient Near East would fear Leviathan, that dragon that ruled the sea. And God says, I go fishing for it. That supernatural power that you fear that seems to be so strong in your life, I can put a fish hook in it. And he goes on, verse 3, he says, will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? So here's this huge, mysterious, unstoppable creature, and God says, he's basically like my puppy. Like he does what I want him to do. He's my servant. He says, will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who is first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So God's showing his power over the most powerful, supernatural, evil creature that there is. The serpent monster in the chaotic sea, and God rules over him. And then God goes on to describe Leviathan in vivid detail. And these are details that even Job, who knew Leviathan existed, could never have come up with because you couldn't see under the sea. You couldn't see all these things. But then God goes on, starting in verse 12, to describe him in all kinds of detail that no human could ever know. He says in verse 12, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his goodly frame. Who can strip off his outer garment? Who would come near him with a bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth is terror. His back is made of rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The folds of his flesh stick together, firmly cast on him and immovable. His heart is hard as a stone, hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. At the crashing, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He counts iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. For him, sling stones are turned to stubble. Clubs are counted as stubble. He laughs at the rattle of javelins. His underparts are like sharp potsherds. He spreads himself like a threshing sledge on the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him, he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. On earth, there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over the sons of pride. So God's describing Leviathan, and he's emphasizing his strength and his power, his unstoppability. And in a lot of ways, Leviathan mimics God. Leviathan is unstoppable, impenetrable, invincible. Seems like Leviathan is omnipotent. In fact, listen to verses 18 to 21 again. He says, his sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. Okay, now listen to this description of God in Psalm 18, verse 7. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. So Leviathan, big evil, mimics God. And this is important because sometimes the suffering that we go through can feel like that. It starts to, in our minds, take on some of the attributes of deity. We go through suffering that seems like it's never ending, and we can convince ourselves that this is eternal, that this will never end. It seems omnipotent. I'm powerless in this situation. It seems omniscient, like we're always getting outwitted by evil. We're getting outwitted by evil people and manipulators that's just always smarter than we are. And Scripture says that Satan masquerades as an angel of light, where Satan takes on these false versions of the attributes of God. And he can convince us that the power of evil is all-powerful. But God has no equal. He plays with Leviathan like he's a pet bird. And God fills his back with his arrows. And in almost gleeful terms, God describes this sea monster. It's almost like God is the mighty hunter who, like, with his eyes lighting up, is describing the strength of his prey. And then the description of Leviathan ends, and so does God's speech. Like, that's it. Right after this description goes into where Job worships, which is weird because God never makes any points. He just describes the satanic sea monster and his rule over it. I mean, I went to college to learn how to write sermons, and I don't really follow the rules, but one of the big rules is that you're supposed to have application points. Like, there's supposed to be some therefore, A, B, C, and D. God doesn't make any of those applications. He just describes his prey, Leviathan, and his superior power over it, and that does the trick. And so what was it about this speech that restored Job's soul here? And what in it could maybe help with ours? What's God doing with this description? Well, one of the things it seems like he's doing is God's pointing to the real enemy in the world. I mean, Job's friends came along and they said Job was the enemy. Job said God was the enemy. But it's like God takes Job to the seashore here and he says, look out there. Look at that powerful serpent. That's the enemy. And God says, Job, do you think I was against you? I mean, I heard way back in chapter 6, verse 4, when you were talking, you didn't know I was listening, but you said, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. And so maybe what God's doing with this speech in part is saying to Job, Job, you're not my target. Leviathan is. Satan is. He's the one I'm shooting my arrows at. He's the real enemy. He's your real enemy. And this vision of God you had before where you thought that God was the chaos monster, I'm not the chaos monster, he is. And Job, you're not my prey, he is. And Job, I want you to know, God maybe says, with no risk of losing this battle, I am at war with him on your behalf. You couldn't see that that's what was going on, but it is what's going on. It's like God is saying to Job, Job, you got me all wrong. The real enemy is Satan. And in our lives, we know that God is sovereign. We know that he rules over everything. We know he has control over everything. But let's not start to think of God as the author of evil, because he's not. He's in control over it. He's giving it some space to operate in his creation for whatever reasons he has. But he's not the one who made it. And he very easily tames it. He can draw it in with a fishhook. It is no match for God. It's allowed to do what it does right now, but God doesn't make evil. God is not evil. He's in a very calculated battle against evil on our behalf, and we are not his target, even though sometimes our suffering makes us think that we are. And now because he's God, he will win at precisely the right moment. He's got this thing completely under control. But God isn't the evil one. God isn't the enemy. He's for us. It's important to recognize who the real enemy is because so often we get locked in battles with one another. Battles with our spouses, battles with each other, with our brothers and sisters in Christ, battles in the church. And it's so easy to treat those other people like they're the ultimate enemy. But sometimes we need to kind of walk along the seashore and be reminded of who the enemy is. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." There are times where sometimes we just see so much evil and so many bad things happening in so many lives that we just have to back away and say, this is a real war. There is a real enemy. And it's not these people. It's not God. There is real satanic power that for a time is doing real damage. So maybe part of what God's doing in this speech is to point Job to who the real enemy is, and to point us to who the real enemy is in our suffering. Also, it's notable that God gives this huge, long description of Leviathan. I mean, Job knew some things about Leviathan. He actually talked about him earlier in the book. But any kind of physical description of Leviathan would have been all murky. It was all obscured by the water and the waves. And God, in vivid detail, describes this thing that has come to symbolize satanic evil. And as you read through the Bible, there aren't a lot of long descriptions of anyone like that. We have very brief descriptions, if any. Like there are no descriptions of the animals when God makes them in Genesis. As he's describing people, I mean, we don't have any physical descriptions of Jesus. We'll have descriptions like Rachel was beautiful, and that's it. Like no other description, like very brief, not a lot of long drawn out descriptions. But here, and there are a couple of them, but here, there's this long, vivid description of this sea dragon, the serpent that symbolized evil. So in giving this huge description, it seems like God is saying, I know more about evil than you do. And God doesn't downplay it. So Job looks at the world and says, how could God be good when there's so much evil in the world? And God says, evil's actually stronger than you think. It's worse than you think. I know about every clasp on every scale on its back. I know its strength. I know its power. And so if you, Job, think, well, I know God isn't good because I understand evil, God says, don't I know it better than you? And I'm telling you, I'm good. And you can't put me in the wrong. And sometimes we'll enter into situations where we see evil in the world that we knew was out there, but we didn't really experience it personally. We didn't know how bad lives could get. We didn't see how bad people could get. We didn't know how bad certain situations were in society or even in the church. And then we get close and we see it and we experience it, and it's like a body blow. I know that when we bring on staff members at the church, we almost have to warn them, like, you are going to see people at some of their lowest moments. And it can be shocking, and you need to be prepared for that. And sure enough, when they join our staff, they see some of those moments, and it's almost like it knocks us out at times. And we'll do a couple of different things when we see that kind of real evil that's in people and in the world. Either we will become malevolent and bitter because things are so bad, or we'll become all the more appreciative of the fact that God is going to defeat this, that God does have power over this, that this will not last forever, because to us, it looks omnipotent, it looks eternal, it looks like it's going to overpower us, it's going to keep going, and God says, no, one day I'm going to draw it all the way in with a fish hook, I'm going to hang it up and sell its body parts to traders. Like, I've got this thing. So God knows evil better than we do, and still reminds us again and again that he's good. Also, as you go through both of these speeches of God, you see that he kind of has a joyful tone in them. He's got a gleeful tone as he describes the way that he's hunting Leviathan. He's got a joyful tone as he describes his whole creation. And that joyful tone shows us his fearlessness, his peace, and his mastery over everything that we're afraid of. And God knows evil better than we do and still speaks of his creation in that joyful tone. God knows how bad things really are, even more than we could. And he still speaks positively about the direction of history. I mean, Job chapter 3, he saw evil in the world, and here's his first thought was, shut this whole thing down. Burn the whole thing down, turn off the lights, no more of this. But God, who knows evil far better than Job does, is not at all pessimistic. And that's because nothing is so sure as the final defeat of Leviathan at the hands of the skilled hunter. In fact, that's the promise all throughout the Bible. I mean, when the serpent came into the garden at the beginning and he deceived Adam and Eve and they fell, and then God came in and he handed out the curse to the serpent, God said in Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. So right there on like page 3 of the Bible, God makes this promise that an offspring of the woman is going to come and crush the head of the serpent. You go to Isaiah 26, and there's this prayer that's being prayed by Israel, and they're lamenting the fact that they failed to change the world, that they thought that they would be able to go out and subdue evil and change the world. And they say this in Isaiah 26, verse 18, we were pregnant, we writhed, but we've given birth to wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. Our family didn't accomplish what I thought we would accomplish. Our ministry didn't accomplish what we thought it would. When I was 20, I thought I was going to change the world, and I haven't changed the world. But then listen to this hope. They say, your dead shall live. Their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed. For behold, the Lord is coming out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And the earth will disclose the blood shed on it and will no more cover its slain. In chapter 27, verse 1, it says, in that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon in that sea. And this is not a promise that God will one day kill the crocodiles. This is a promise that God will fully and finally conquer satanic evil. Though we fail to change the world, we fail to live consistently with the things we believe. We fail to persevere well in our walks with him, but one day he returns and he kills the fleeing serpent. It'll happen, it's sure. You go to the end of the Bible, Revelation 20, verse 1, he says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be raised for a little while. And you go down to verse 10, it says, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. That's happening. And Leviathan is real, evil is real, sin and Satan and death are real, and God joyfully, gleefully is hunting that serpent and will one day fully and finally slay him. So therefore, God's joyful even though there is great evil in the world. And so if these days you're waking up to a world just filled with leviathans, you can take joy in the power and the skill and the knowledge and the wisdom of the hunter. Now, evil is actually worse than we know. And the one who knows it perfectly is joyful. So look to him. When our kids were little, if they would fall down, they would immediately look up to us, almost to figure out how they should react to that. So they fall down on the kitchen floor, and if we very quickly were to say, "You're okay," then pretty often they would get up and say, "I'm okay," and keep going. But if the same fall, they looked up at us and we were panicked and we were rushing over to them and we were breathless, they would definitely start crying. They would freak out themselves. If we're panicked, they're going to panic too. And so here we are in this world with devils filled that threatens to undo us. We look around and we see evil and loss and grief and sin and fear and uncertainty and sickness. And we see evil government and broken churches and hopeless situations. We've crashed into evil and suffering. But then we look up to our Father and he's smiling. He's not at all panicked. Which means, Christian, you're okay. Evil is more deadly than we feared, and God is enjoying the goodness of his creation without being anxious or troubled at all. And so we can look up to our Father to gauge what our reaction should be. I mean, if God's joyful, and he is, can't we be too? And of course, we mourn, we weep, we cry, we feel those losses. But we look up to God and he says, "You're okay. This will be okay." If God is completely confident in the defeat of evil, can't we rest knowing that the defeat of evil is sure? This is basically a done deal. And we wake up to panic all around us. We have panicked kids and panicked employees and panicked news media. But we look up to our Father, and with a smile on his face, he says, "I've got this. I've got this thing on a reel." Man, if I believed that like I should, I would be far less anxious. I'd be far less prone to making decisions from fear. My attitudes would be different. My patterns of frenzied overwork would change. And that lurking fear that maybe this time some evil circumstance will win, that would all go away. If I could really learn to look up to the Father who knows evil better than I do, but is reeling it in and laughing at it, then my reaction to life would be far different. When Scripture describes Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 31, verse 25, says, "Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." And this is the Christian response to evil. We don't deny that it exists. We don't call it good. We don't say that we don't feel losses or remorse or pain. We grieve. Evil's real. It's worse than we know. And God's got it. So we're okay. And if even though that evil exists in the world, even though Leviathan exists in the sea, if God can still look at his world and call it good, rejoice in it, while not denying that there's evil and brokenness in it, and if we look to him to gauge how we should react when we crash into it, shouldn't his perspective become our perspective? And don't you think we could take a lot more joy in people if we didn't feel like we had to deny that there's evil in them, but we also could acknowledge at the exact same time that they are made in God's image and worthy of dignity and respect? We could enjoy them, we could be fascinated by them, we could befriend them without feeling the need to endorse sinful behaviors or deny that there's sin in them. I mean, Leviathan is real, and Leviathan is in a good and beautiful world. Evil is real, and it's in people that are wonderfully made in God's image. If we believe that this could all be true, then we could take a lot more joy in our spouses, our kids, our church, in all of our lives. If we didn't have to deny that wrong exists, but also we shared our Father's jovial and peaceful attitude about the whole thing. God takes joy in his creation where evil and chaos dwell. And so could we take joy in our families when sometimes we see that evil and the chaos? Could we take joy in people, in our spouses, in our kids, in our church? And to make this even better news, as you follow the storyline of the Bible all the way through, we get to the cross of Jesus. And that's the place where the head of the serpent is bruised by the heel of the Savior. Jesus goes to the cross because God doesn't deny the badness of evil. On the cross, we can see that our evil, our sin was so bad that the Son of God had to be crushed for it. But Jesus rose from the dead. And that's how sure the final defeat of evil is. Evil is not all powerful. Jesus crushed its head, and then one day it'll be thrown into that lake of fire. Overcoming physical Leviathan is nothing compared to overcoming death. But God burst out of that grave just as jovially as he would conquer Leviathan. Who then can stand before him? And so as much as you're suffering, you are not his ultimate target. God has bigger fish to fry. And he is at work in his world for our good. And he even went to that cross for our good. And if he loves us that much, and he's in that much control, he has that much power over Satan, sin, and death, and evil. But let's just hang our hopes in him and rejoice. When we crash into life, let's look up at our Father who says, I've got this, you're okay. And live like that's true. Here in a second, we'll be inviting the Christians among us to take the Lord's Supper. And this is another reminder of this, that we should have died for our sin. Our evil is that bad. Evil's not just out there, it's in here, it's in all of our hearts. But in the great exchange, Jesus came to slay Leviathan. He took our sin on himself. He went to the cross where he died in our place, and 3 days later, he defeated the grave. And the way that we receive that gift is through faith. It's by turning from our sin and unbelief and turning to him in faith. And this Lord's Supper reminds us of his body torn and his blood spilled so that we could be in his presence, in his peace forever when evil is finally defeated.